Happy New Year, everybody. On the first poll hub of 2023, we recorded as late in the week as we possibly could to give Republicans a chance to choose a speaker, but to no avail. We're looking at what this week's chaos may herald for Republicans and Democrats down the line, based on what Americans told us in our recent December poll. Interesting stuff. Then CNN's polling punster, Ariel Edwards-Levy, joins to discuss a recent New York Times article that has a lot of pollsters, including us, pretty worked up. How come? Well, stick with us to find out, and to find out that a fun fact question from 1957 can be very misleading if you don't read it carefully. And by you, I mean me. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm J.D. Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
I'm Mary Griffith.
And I'm Lee Maringoff.
Well, history is being made in Congress, in Washington, in the House of Representatives this week, but
That's
not
what we call
exact.
it? History?
Well, it's funny you say that because as at this moment, and we are recording this on Thursday, midday, it is not history. It is in the middle of making history, but not the kind that Republicans were hoping for. We've been watching a number of votes. I think as we're chatting now, we're in vote number 7 for a Speaker of the House of Representatives. This is with a narrow majority that the Republicans have, but with about 20 Republicans who have yet to come on board with the rest of their brethren to pick a speaker.
Ancestran.
Yes.
Yes, ancestran. Yes. I met that, in the Latin way
I
of
know.
older day. But we actually did a poll in December, which we had chatted about Congress, and this is probably not surprising to most Americans. 58% of Americans actually at that point in mid-December had no confidence in the Democrats and the Republicans to work together. I don't think they were focusing on any particular party. I think they were, in that particular poll, they were disgusted with both. The Republicans certainly have a moment at this point to change Americans' minds about that, but I don't think that's the way that they are going. Understand, too, and just to put this in perspective, this no confidence number of 58%, it was 23% in 2008. So if we feel like things have gotten, more cantankerous over the last decade or more, they certainly have. But guys, what exactly is happening here, and what does this mean for the GOP?
Well, I would just start out by saying in that same poll, people tell us they want the two sides to compromise. But right now, we're not even getting a compromise within one side, let alone two sides. I mean, the Democrats are unified and they're, sort of waiting for the shoe to fall. And I think for the Republican Party, I mean, in some ways, I don't know if evolution is the right word, but this is sort of the post-Trump era, although he's still trying to play a role. But the elections didn't go in that way, and the Republicans narrowly got the majority. And now, it's the old, you sleep in the bed you made. And if you have a Republican Party which has some real safe district representatives who are into celebrity Congress, where they love the attention, I mean, nobody can really say what this battle is about. It's not a battle over taxes or interest rates or immigration. It's a battle about who's supposed to take the leadership, and they can't find the majority because there's not a lot of votes to play with. You sort of almost have to get all but, I guess, 5, and they're not getting there at this
But
point.
it is also a negotiation. And
Yeah.
Jay, what are some of the issues that are really at stake here?
Well, I'm not sure that the 5 that Lee's talking about, which is 20 or 10 or 5 or who knows, you only need 5 to keep Kevin McCarthy from being speaker. I don't know that there are any issues that these folks are talking about other than ego. So Kevin McCarthy's ego is why he wants to be speaker and will give away anything to be speaker. And as Lee pointed out, it's like Lauren Boebert and these folks, although she's one of them that's actually, no, but which one? So Marjorie Taylor Greene's backing McCarthy and Boebert's not, right? Yeah. Okay.
They're using the word rebel to describe the group of 20 who are.
I mean, they're all the congressperson from, the Fox News Network. I mean, they're not, they don't represent people. They represent their attempts to get on camera and butter up their ego. I think there's two things here. One, I don't think this is a continuation of Trump so much. This is the Republican Party that kind of started with Reagan, but really got going with Newt Gingrich, which is that the government is bad. Burn the government down. The government can't do anything right. And we heard that yesterday in some of the speeches. One of the nominating speeches in particular yesterday for not Kevin McCarthy was the government is broken. Washington is broken. It can't be fixed. It's just a disaster. And most Americans didn't used to believe that. And I don't think from our own polling, despite some of these numbers, I don't think most Americans believe that the government is irreparably broken. But that's the hardcore conservatives. That is their message. That is their motive. That is their true belief. And I think that is what we're seeing the chickens come home to roost in, or the bed that you're lying in, or whatever. I think it goes all the way back to them. The second thing I'd say is that there are people who were elected a month and a half ago, Republicans, who will not win their seats in 2024, barring some miracle. And that's before this. They are in districts, including some that we know very well, because they're right here in the Hudson Valley, that went +8, +10 Biden. And in a presidential election year, we all know they're not going to win re-election, barring a terrible Democratic candidate, something big happening, whatever.
And that never happens.
That never happens. Right. It could happen. So I think, I mean, here, I'll go into Crazyville here. Here's my prediction, that one of the possibilities that people aren't talking about now is that these Republicans who recognize they will not win in 2024 in their districts, a few of them come together and like Jared Golden from Maine, the Democrat from Maine, who is so independent that he's barely a Democrat, that they declare themselves independents aside from the Republican Party. It helps them with a chance to win in 2024 re-election. And they back, I don't know, maybe they back Jeffries for speaker, but they say they'll never, actually, vote with the Democrats. Something like that. I think that these people who have nothing to lose because they can't win re-election without something dramatic, I think maybe they end up being the ones who kind of outplay and outmaneuver these rebels. I don't know.
Well, look, there's nothing more important to Congress than self-preservation. And right now, what's going to happen if they don't resolve this soon is right now, the House of Representatives, isn't really functioning. And therefore,
well, also that's also indicative in some of the concessions that they're asking for. So I think one of the most recent ones is that that primary open seat primaries in Republican safe districts are other candidates are not funded, so they're not competitive primaries. So absolutely, having one member have the ability to call a vote to oust the speaker. It's about individual power and it's about self-preservation.
But here's what happens. It becomes substantive. Look, some of these people, they can't now participate in intelligence briefings because there is no...
None of them can.
There's no formal... They're not...
They're not sworn in. They're not sworn in.
None of them, even the incumbents,
except for Congressman Santos, who says he was sworn in, but then again,
that's another New York homegrown.
Yes, but we won't go there right now. But here's what happens realistically: if this doesn't kind of find a way to solve, there are things like Social Security checks and veterans benefits and a tax ceiling. A debt ceiling.
A debt ceiling.
But
that's in the fall.
Yeah, people would argue there are no tax ceilings.
Yeah. But
Lee, that's in the fall. I mean, I know, I get where you're going here, but I mean, I think what the longer this goes, I think the more it does reinforce with the American people anyway, that the House is a fairly useless body,
Yeah. Well,
or
we saw
can
in
be
our
a fairly
last
useless
poll.
body.
Yeah, and we saw in our last poll that 24% thought the last session accomplished significant things, which is a horrible number, but it was the highest number we'd gotten in quite some time. So people were actually feeling a little bit better about Congress. And symbolically, what I found really jumping out yesterday was Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell jointly appearing in Kentucky to celebrate the infrastructure program that the Democrats and Republicans put together. And so, hey, folks, we can work together. And now let's go back to the House of Representatives and see what's going on.
So we talk a lot about polling on this podcast, and we've talked a lot, obviously, in the last 6 months to a year about the challenges that the polling industry had coming into the 2022 elections. We talked a lot about the stuff that we've been trying to do. And since the election, of course, we've talked about how we did. But there was an article in the New York Times over the holiday break. In fact, it was on New Year's Eve that it dropped, and it had 3 bylines, so it was a big deal for the Times. It got a lot of sharing. We saw it everywhere. And the article, which was titled "The Red Wave Washout: How Skewed Polls Fed a False Election Narrative," got a lot of attention, mainly bad from pollsters, for professional pollsters, because I think we had some bones to pick with some of the things in it. I think the premise of it may have been fine, but some of the things, especially about the polling industry, seem to be based in maybe in the 2016 era, but certainly not in the 2022 or 2023 area. We noticed that one of our favorite polling friends, Ariel Edwards-Levy, who is the polling and analytics editor at CNN, had some things to say. And so we thought, who better than to invite on to the first podcast of 2023 to talk about this. Ariel, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This article, you had some things to say. One of the things you said is, and I'll quote your tweet, "Show me 3 paragraphs that demonstrate a complete and absolute misunderstanding of the current state of the polling industry, the issues it faces, and the problems that are driving them." Quoting 3 paragraphs from the article, the most important one, I think, is that, talking about traditional phone polling being very expensive and there's no other way to poll. Maybe I'm simplifying it, but tell us about what your reaction to this was.
Yeah. So, I mean, should say, first of all, I think that was Twitter, besides lending itself to wordplay, lends itself to sort of a, dismissive attitude sometimes. And I think that was me sort of responding particularly to that section, which I think had some issues with this framing. I think the overall point that the article makes, which is that this election and some of the polling that came out of this election really demonstrates why it's so important to be careful about what polling you're looking at and to be discerning about, especially as journalists, what we cover is so important. And I think that overarching point is a strong one. I think what happened is that there's a lot of sort of history about how the polling industry has come to the place where it is, which understandably was maybe not the main point of the article. And I think in those paragraphs got a little jumbled. And what I was sort of really reacting to there is a combination of a few different trends that have sort of coalesced at the same time. And what I think we've seen is, one, that there's been this huge sort of industry-wide shift over maybe even the past decade at this point, where the traditional model of, dual frame phone polling, RDD, is not the standard anymore. And pretty much nearly everybody is trying out new things. And then separately, there's a trend about horse race polling and how many people are doing horse race polling, especially from sort of what I would call legacy institutions, media outlets, universities, think tanks. And then beyond that, there's also questions about things like aggregation, how these surveys are presented, and whether surveys that are not coming from some of those outlets are still getting equal play, even if they are maybe not meeting the same standards in terms of transparency, or if they're being propagated by people who have an ulterior motive. And then there's also a bunch of things about how campaigns are using them, which is out of my bailiwick, so I will leave that to the campaign pollsters. But, I think one of the things that really sort of struck me there was the sort of idea that, phone polling is the only way to do things, And that B, the reason that you were seeing less horse race polling was because phone polling was now expensive. And that seemed to me to be really just sort of conflating a number of separate things that are happening in terms of how people are doing polling, who's doing polling, and what pollsters are trying to focus on.
You bring up the buzzword aggregation. Talk to us a little bit more about the role that aggregators play in this misperception of how the polls performed in the election.
Yeah. So I should say, first of all, that I am not somebody who is, deeply anti-aggregation. Before I was at CNN, I was at HuffPost Pollster, which was doing precisely that. But
Yep. Yep.
I think that aggregation is so hard, and doing it in a way that is useful and that actually helps enhance our understanding of polls is so much more complicated than just sort of throwing all the numbers in a blender. It requires a lot of editorial decisions. And I think the current state of the industry has made that even more clear, because what you're seeing is polls that are, I mean, first of all, just even from there are these little decisions every day. If one pollster is flooding the zone and releasing things every day, do you put some sort of stop to make sure that their numbers are not being treated, are not, being weighted for like 8 times more than someone who polls less frequently? If somebody releases 9 different voter models, what do you include there? So I think the instinct to look at what polling is out there is really helpful. I think it's good to be aware of what polling is being released, to say, I'm not just going to look at one poll, I'm going to see the totality of what's being released. But then, frankly, especially in this cycle, and I think the New York Times article gets to that, there are some things that really do not need to be looked at, either because the methodology is not strong. And, I don't think there's one true methodology at this point, but there are things that we know we should not be doing. There are issues where people are just being completely opaque about what it is that they are doing. And I think that, we've basically mandated that for things to be covered, you have to be very clear about what you are doing in your surveys and what you are asking people and how you're finding people. And then beyond that, I think also this is really, I think, should spark a conversation about thinking about what people are trying to accomplish by releasing a survey. With media surveys, with academic surveys, I think our interest is to try to understand what's happening and to share that with our viewers, with our readers. And it's not that partisan polling is inherently bad, but when that's getting released to the public, there is also a different interest, which is to try to share a certain narrative. And I think that's something that needs to be treated with the same sort of skepticism that you would treat any other release of data. And when people fail to do that, I think you see, some of what we saw this cycle.
I think what bothered me as a political reporter for 20 years or whatever it was, is that there was no self-own in this at all. I mean, the Times was as guilty as anybody else of some of their political reporters following the narrative of the red wave based on all of the things that are covered in this article. I think what kind of bothered me was that there didn't seem to be any acceptance of the responsibility of journalists to do a better job of separating the wheat from the chaff. And then I get it. This was not an article about the state of polling. That was kind of that's part of this. And that's the part I think we all have trouble with. But it just bothered me that there are organizations, you mentioned it, that there are organizations that have moved over time, like us, from just RDD to hybrid modes. There are a lot of good organizations that have been trying really hard since 2016 to figure out why polling wasn't working the way it had for decades. And that kind of just gets pushed aside into this, well, phone polling's too expensive, and then it's really cheap to do internet polls, and so partisan polls flood the zone with internet polls. There was nothing in there about Siena, which is the Times own pollster. There was nothing in there about what we did. And I'm not trying to toot our own, we're not the only ones that have done it. And I think that's what bothered me. Am I being too touchy about this?
I mean, I obviously have the same sort of instinctual reaction. And I do think it's something where it's, an article that's about trying to be about a lot of things at once. But I think, like you were saying, that this really is, on one hand, people have been trying to move. Like, it has not been a static ground since 2016. But I think that experimentation is a different conversation than whether new pollsters that are coming in and using some
fair.
of those same methodologies. And I think sort of the underlying issue and maybe why this presents a problem, especially, in newsrooms where people aren't as coordinated with having, and the Times has some very good pollsters that they're working with. So I don't think that that's necessarily the case here. But,
Right.
I think it's this thing where in the old days when the barrier to entry to polling of any kind was so steep, you could say, okay, well, if this is a poll that's getting conducted at all, it probably has some sort of backstops. And now that's not the case. And I don't think that's new completely, because we had the same discussion over IVR, way back when that was still vaguely feasible. And that was sort of the same thing. And now it's very easy to field something on the internet, and that's not the same thing as I think what people are trying to do that's rigorous that can also be on the internet. The mode is not really the issue here.
Lee and Barb tend to say that we as pollsters fight the last war when we approach a new election cycle and a new election season. And we're 2 years out from 1 year now to 2024.
Yeah.
God.
Oh,
Thanks,
boy.
Mary.
Yeah, let's
Thanks
stop
for
the switching
spoiling
now.
it.
Yeah, I know. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
So what do you think needs to be done to change the narrative about polls and pollsters so that we're not having the same conversation a year and a half from now?
I mean, I think that the thing that I have always said about polling is, and this is not just me who's saying this, but two things. One is that polling is more useful when we talk openly about what it does and does not tell us. And two, that when polls disagree, that in itself should tell us something. And here, what we saw, and I mean, part of, I think, what rubbed me the wrong way about the Times article a little bit is that it treated this as a new discovery. But I think people had been saying this, for months, even prior to the election, is that there was this very obvious gulf opening up between what sort of more established nonpartisan pollsters were showing and what some of these other surveys were purporting to show. So I think that, continuing to talk about that helps. And I think looking back at this campaign, the polls really did provide us with some useful information. I think that if you looked at the surveys, they did provide reasons to say this does not look like a Republican blowout in the old model. If we didn't have polling data, I don't know, for instance, how people would even have been able to say definitively overturning Roe v. Wade was unpopular.
Right.
My first love with polling has always been public opinion rather than just the horse race numbers. And I think being able to look at data that tells us about the electorate and about how we understand what's going on. And I think, if you looked at the polling and if you looked at the polling that was carefully done and that was transparent and that was done with the purpose of understanding the electorate, I think it told you a lot about the sort of cross pressures and contrasting forces that I think helped shape this election. And so I just think that ultimately you can't control bad actors and you can't control flooding the zone. And I think the best thing we can, at least I'm going to try to do, is to look at data, be cognizant of what my blind spots there could be, try to figure out what I feel comfortable saying off of that data, and try to figure out what it says that's useful, that says something about the election that is not, and sometimes it's just the election is going to be close or there's a lot of uncertainty here, and that's something too. But I don't know that there's any way of avoiding this story, because it's been my experience that the people who immediately after election are very upset that the polls that they looked at were not exactly right will then be the loudest voices looking at those polls again a month from now.
Yeah. It seems like in 2016, the lesson for the polling industry was to get into the sausage making and figure out what went wrong. And the lesson in 2022, coming into 2023 in the next election cycle, may be education of the folks that consume polls. So I don't know. That's there's my recommendation.
I do think that obviously Marist was one of the people doing this. CNN has been among the people doing this, but I think that we're continuing to find what are new ways that we can do polling. And I think most pollsters are having that discussion because in some ways it's freeing that there's not one perfect way of doing this. There's a lot of ways. People are changing the way they use technology. And I think it's all up to all of us to try to keep looking at mail, to look at text, to look at the internet, and to find the best way of reaching people where they are and conducting surveys in a way that makes sense, from every perspective, when that's accuracy, when that's cost, when that's how people interact with the world. And I think that continues to be a work in progress.
Well, Ariel, thank you so much for joining us on the first Poll Hub of 2023. Ariel Edwards-Levy, she's the polling and analytics editor at CNN, one of the polling gurus over there. And again, watch for her humor. Very funny, very wordplay kind of stuff. But watch for her insights too, because they say a lot about what we're doing as a polling industry and a lot about how people are consuming these polls as well. Ariel, thanks so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
And it's now fun fact time. And we promise you this one will be fun because we can do a lot of speculation. So Gallup in 1957 asked what they thought was a reasonable question. What happens if the work week is cut down to 32 hours? What would workers do with their extra time? There is no category for pollsters during election season, which would not be reasonable at all. But they did get responses, which number one is people would do more recreational things like fish golf, going to beach sports, or they might be working around the house and gardening or just relaxing and loafing around. I can think of things I would do, and it probably has to do with watching sports and things like that. But 32 hours, that's interesting work week concept. What do you guys think about this?
Well, I find it really interesting. I mean, perhaps in 1957, they were assuming they would maintain their greater hour salary or have their hourly pay increased, because the answers, most of the answers that are popping up here are assuming they actually don't need other income.
Yeah,
Although
there was
15%,
yeah,
yeah,
did say that
15%
they
did
would,
say,
yeah, they would find another job to add to their income as they saw this could be either an opportunity to add to your income or to compensate for the lost income, one way or the other. But in any case, there was, you're right. The whole focus is like, gosh, now I have an extra, block of time. What would I do with this?
yeah, and
Free time.
also, I think, in 1957, work was really, really different. And you didn't have, multiple people needing to work to support a household. So I think it'd be really interesting to ask a question similar to this now, because work looks nothing like it did back in the
No,
1950s.
but Harm, who would do that? What kind of organization would be able to ask Americans a question? So my favorite answers here, and then I want to ask Casey what she thinks about this since she's done some research on this. My favorite answer on this was 6% said drinking and gambling. So there's 6% of the people here who are honest, and 7%, and this is more of my favorite answer. 7% said crime, juvenile delinquency, accidents, running around and getting into mischief. I think this is an open end, right? This is an open-ended question where they combine them. But
and it was face-to-face interviews too.
Yeah.
So much for people lying to pollsters.
Right. Somebody said to an interview, standing at their doorstep, "What would you do if you worked just 32 hours?" "I'd commit crime." So Casey, what do you think about this?
I'd like to point out, Jay, that the question actually says, how will workers, not you in particular, and I'm jumping off of what Barb said.
Very good.
About like the time period and who was working, predominantly men. This does not give a very good picture of men in the 50s, because when people were asked if they had more time on their hands, they would commit crime, have accidents, run around, get into mischief. But worse, having the men around more would make the kids be juvenile delinquents. Because were the kids in 1957 in these 32-hour, 40-hour work weeks? No.
Well, Casey, you've said a lot of things over the years that we've worked together, and usually I have a good response. You left me speechless on that. I'm not quite sure where to go with that. It does seem rather um, disturbing. How's that?
I feel like this was asked in person of a lot of very, very frustrated housewives thinking about their men being home more.
Well, it does say 1,520 adults, and Gallup in 1957 was certainly well versed in doing a accurate sample and all that.
Yep.
So they've
Oh,
got
yeah.
to talk to some men as well. But your point is well taken that this was asked not of what you would do, but what would workers do. And maybe it gives more insight into what people thought about working men, as you suggest in 1957, than it does about what they would do if they had more free time. Fair point.
And it definitely explains the drinking and the gambling.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review. Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal accessible from our website.
If you have questions for us, tweet them directly to @MaristPoll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it will cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub,
There is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll
see you
see you
next
next
time.
time.